You have a quorum for both bodies
All
for
right.
sure.
Well, okay. Well, good. We'll start. Welcome, everybody. It is Monday, and it's April 19th, 2021, and this is Village of Lake Bluff Board of Trustees and Historic Preservation Commission. This is a workshop to have a dialogue regarding revisions to and administration of the village's historic preservation regulations. Drew, have you taken roll call and you've got all that in order?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, sir. Thank you. At this point in time, we allot 15 minutes for anyone who would like to speak tonight from the audience on anything that is not on tonight's agenda. Is there anyone that wishes to do so? Not hearing any, Drew. Are you?
No, ma'am. Nobody's raising their
Not
hand
many.
through the Zoom meeting.
Okay. All right. Okay. This is a joint workshop tonight. No final decisions will be made at this. This hopefully will be a productive and robust dialogue amongst the members of both boards. Just to give a little background, over the past 3 years, the Historic Preservation Commission, HPC, has discussed and debated changes to Lake Bluff's historic preservation regulations. These regulations provide for the designation and protection of buildings and landscape features that have special significance to the history and development of Lake Bluff. The HPC believes regulatory changes will help the village be an effective steward of the village's architectural legacy. To that end, and after soliciting feedback from a multitude of stakeholders, the HPC unanimously voted on October 14, 2020, to recommend a number of amendments to the village's historic preservation regulations. This recommendation was presented to the village board on October 26, 2020, and after receiving public comment, the village board unanimously voted to send the proposed regulatory changes back to the HPC for further discussion and public comment. With this direction and after developing an outreach plan, the HPC held 4 separate community listening sessions through January and February based on themes from previous stakeholder involvement. Following these public meetings, the HPC met again on 3 other occasions to receive more community feedback, adjust their recommendations, discuss possible preservation incentives, and seek consensus around which structures were viewed as the highest priority for preservation, as requested by stakeholders during their meetings. After all these meetings, the HPC voted 4-1 at its most recent meeting, which is March 15th, to transmit the attached recommendations to the village board. The dissenting member expressed discomfort with recommending changes that do not eliminate the village's ability to designate a property as a historic landmark without the owner's consent. Given the depth and breadth of policy issues associated with the HPC's recommendations, the village board determined at its March 22nd meeting that a joint meeting with the HPC would be best format to hear and consider the attached recommendations. Staff anticipates HPC Chair Steve Krause will make the presentation to the village board on Monday night. And again, we will have a robust conversation, hopefully, following this and possible next step, given the fact that at this point in time on this date, we are basically will soon be a transitional board moving on to another board. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn this over to the HPC Chair, Steve Krause. Steve?
Thank you, and thank you all. I'm looking forward to a robust conversation, as Kathy said, on a couple of different things. We could go to the discussion topic slide, please. I'll start with a little bit of background. Our historic preservation ordinance is about 20 years old. I want to go back 20 years and think a little bit about what it was like from a historic preservation perspective in the village, and then talk about what we've done, what the goals were, and what we've accomplished over those 20 years. but more importantly, the next two discussion points. So we on the HPC spent a couple of years talking about a way to think about historic preservation strategically. And we'd like to share with the village board, again, I haven't done this for a while, but share the strategic concept, the context of historic preservation in the village under this heading of Choose Like Bluff. We'll go through the components of the strategy and talk about potential implementation of portions of that strategy as some of our to-dos. We'll then roll into the real reason for tonight's discussion, and that's to review our proposed amendments to the Historic Preservation Ordinance. These are still in draft form. We know we have discussions that need to happen, but we want to share with you where we are and the input that we've received from the village, and hopefully have conversations around both the strategic context and the tactics around implementation in our next steps. So first, a little bit of background as to where we've come from. So about
I can't hear in here.
I can hear you. I just totally lost audio from Zoom.
the tactical goal was the second one, and that was to preserve the historic resources and the character of the village, thereby enhancing the village. The third was to protect and enhance the attractiveness to village residents.
No, that was me turning on my computer so I can pay attention to the meeting.
No, maybe if you just unmute. I don't know what's going on with that. You just unmute and then it'll come through your mic.
Okay.
Past and preservation of the past in terms of its housing stock. The sixth was to encourage landmarking as a tool for identifying those structures that deserve special consideration upon potential future changes. And then the seventh, and one we'll talk quite a bit about today, because we wish to reinvigorate the education of the general public on the significance of historic preservation. So these are 20-year-old goals. I think they are relevant today as they were 20 years ago. Let's look now at what we've done over the last really 5 years. Excuse me. So beginning in 2015, at around the 15-year anniversary of passage of the ordinance, there were a number of suggestions to modify the historic preservation ordinance. The board met a number of times And finally, in March of 2017, the village president specifically asked the Historic Preservation Commission to study and review potential changes to the Historic Preservation Ordinance. Tonight's meeting is really the culmination of that process, not culmination, it's a waypoint, and hopefully reaching some future decision on the perspectives of preservation with respect to the village. In late in 2017, the commission made recommendations to the board. Those were not approved, they were tabled. And finally, in May of 2018, there was a new strategic framework that the Historic Preservation Commission began to develop, which we call Choose Like Bluff. You'll see in a minute. It's a life cycle approach to historic preservation that thinks of preservation in the context of someone discovering Lake Bluff for the first time. But Choose Lake Bluff, think of that as a strategic framework for dealing with historic preservation within the village. We held a number of workshops in 2019 to develop the Choose Lake Bluff concept. We began to work on ordinance revisions. The HPC began to work on those. And finally, delayed a lot by the pandemic, we did have a ordinance revision workshop with the board in October of 2020. We were asked to get more feedback from the village. We held a number of feedback sessions with the community. We'll talk about those in a minute. And finally, we made our next set of recommendations to the board on March 16th of this year. We had suggested a workshop since we know we're not done, since we know there are a lot of things in our recommendation that require discussion and additional considerations. So that's why we recommended this workshop to begin analyzing the recommendations that the commission has put together. So let's review the strategic framework, the Choose Lake Bluff framework. So this is a life cycle approach. So think of the way, now go back to there you go, stay right there for a second. So think of an individual who is looking to buy a home and is looking in the North Shore and doesn't know Lake Bluff, maybe knows it as a point on the map, maybe sees it as a stop on the train station, maybe drives past it on the highway to go north or south, but begins to look for a home and begins to think about where a person wants to live. So the first thing that we think about in trying to make Lake Bluff an attractive destination to a new homeowner is branding. So the first part of our Choose Lake Bluff strategic framework is dealing with a homeowner, a potential homeowner who's thinking about buying a home, and we want that person to discover Lake Bluff. We want the first impression that that homeowner has, either in press, online, or hopefully driving through the community, stopping and having lunch or dinner, stopping at one of our watering holes, stopping at the beach, looking at the parks. We want those first impressions to be strong. We want those first impressions, which we think have a context of history. You can tell this is an old place when you drive through. You can tell it's a wonderfully maintained community of single-family homes. We want the first impression of Lake Bluff to be attractive. I want to learn more. I want knowledge. I want to understand what Lake Bluff is. So our second point in this strategic framework is knowledge. So it's information. How do we get information about individual properties and the historic context of individual properties to homeowners as they're in this state of exploring Lake Bluff as a place to live? We hope to be able to provide, and we'll talk about what some of our tactics are. We hope to be able to provide that strategic context, that information for individuals who are looking to buy to make that purchase decision into Lake Bluff. So those two, branding and knowledge, are really part of the outreach component of Choose Lake Bluff. The last two are really policy decisions that the village board can make in terms to to have that individual who is interested and knowledgeable about Lake Bluff to actually want to buy. And in our view, there are two types of policy decisions that the board should think about. One is related to incentives. So these are, I found the perfect place. I love the home that I'm in. It needs some work, like a lot of old homes do. What incentives can be put in place for that person who loves what he or she sees in Lake Bluff to buy a house and fix it up? So that's part of the policy decisions we'll talk about in a bit. And then for that property owner who loves Lake Bluff, who wants to live here, but either isn't interested in or can't find the perfect house to rehabilitate because they're interested in something new. They're interested in redevelopment. So what guidelines will the village present to that potential future homeowner to allow that individual to invest in Lake Bluff in the context and the strategic concept of the historic village that we really are? So let's look at each of those four components of Choose Lake Bluff. But before we do that, here's a framework. Now go ahead, next slide. Sorry, there you go. So here's the framework. This is just putting the strategy in a couple of bullet points. So the first framework, the first strategy is the concept of stewardship. The Historic Preservation Commission would love to be, now stay on that slide, the framework slide. There you go. Sorry. So encourage stewardship. We would like to be able to attract buyers. We believe that there are buyers who are interested in Lake Bluff because of its history, because of the housing stock that we have. They are interested in being stewards of that history, and we believe that we can and should attract those individuals into our village. We also believe that there are certain individuals who we can attract to the village that have a bias for preservation, and we think the village in its policies should discuss, the village board should discuss whether or not, how strongly that bias is presented in our policies. Influence early decisions leading to preservation over demolition, but always under the context, importantly, the core principle that property owners retain ultimate control over their property. So we're not looking to force a decision on a property owner. We think it's appropriate to encourage thinking of preservation first. We also want to build on branding and values, which we think is critical. We want to bridge information gaps in the marketplace. The HPC has had too many situations where property owners, new people who purchased in the village, come to us wanting to do something with their property and either are excited or mad because they didn't, as they say, I didn't know, I had no idea this property was important in the history of the village. This property had the history and the context that it did. I wish I would have known before so I could have taken advantage in a different way. So we want to bridge those information gaps to the degree that we can. And we really want to work with community partners, with the real estate community to make this as positive as possible from a purchasing perspective. Okay, now the next slide. So now we'll go through the four strategic concepts. The first, we'll talk about goals and tools. So the first is branding. Again, I'm thinking of buying a home and I'm discovering Lake Bluff. How can we shape those first impressions of Lake Bluff? How can we have individuals looking to buy a home recognize that our history is part of our brand, that our past is integral to our present and to our future? We believe a focus is on future residents because, quite honestly, the vast majority of people who live in the village love the village. They're great stewards of their property. They do an amazing job in maintaining the character of the village. We would prefer to focus on future residents as they are beginning to make that purchase decision. So there are a couple of tools. These are educational tools, educational initiatives. We, for want of a better name, call it Lake Bluff at a Glance. There's a place to go either online or in written documentation that tells individuals about Lake Bluff, that talks about its past, present, and future, that makes Lake Bluff more accessible, if you would. Some of the new things that have been done since we've begun working on this strategy are the walking tours, the historical plaques, things that we can point to for someone learning about Lake Bluff to go from this first impression to our next page, which is knowledge. Now that I know a little bit more about Lake Bluff, I want to make the decision I want to buy here. So our goals here in facilitating knowledge transfer, now that a new buyer knows about Lake Bluff, we want that buyer to have access to all the information that's possible to get regarding the historic context of their property, their individual property. We want to promote a sense of stewardship in advance of purchase. We want a property owner to think about preservation and rehabilitation and to think about redevelopment, but think about those with all the knowledge and with the expectations and incentives that are built into the strategy. So a number of tools. We have shared with this group our beta version of what we call Lake Bluff Online. So Lake Bluff Online is a database. It's a GIS-based database where, when it's finished, and that's one of the things we are asking the village board is to instruct us to finish the online database. But you'll be able to go online at one website and be able to look at every house within the village, be able to zoom into that house, be able to click on it, and not only have the basic information that you would expect from Lake County. So when the assessor thinks it was built, what the assessed valuation is, what the tax base is, what school district that particular property is in, who the elected officials are, all of the things that are available online through the county, but also the history of that particular property. So when it was built, who the architect is to the degree that we know, what historical significance of the architect or of the builder, or importantly, of the people who lived there. What's the context of that particular property to the history of Lake Bluff? The idea here is that all of the information, the financial, the social, the architectural, the cultural, all of the information on every property in Lake Bluff would be available through a click in one online database. We could also, perhaps working with our real estate community, identify homes that are for sale or for rent, perhaps. There's lots of things we can do with an online database. But that's to facilitate knowledge. That's to have an educated buyer who wants to buy in Lake Bluff and wants to know all they can about their individual property. So those are the branding components. Let's go to the two policy initiatives. So policy incentives is one. So I understand Lake Bluff. I found a house, it's the perfect place. I really want to rehabilitate it. How do I go about doing that? So we need to have a process in place that removes or reduces obstacles for preservation of a property, financial incentives, zoning incentives, other incentives, other encouragements, other help around the context of that structure within the global history of the village. Help homeowners financially and with education to really become stewards of their property, to do what we can as a village to welcome these new property owners and to thank them for their investment in the history of the village. So we'll talk a little bit later on about tools, about policies that we're suggesting, about incentives that we feel the village should be offering, and about some zoning considerations. These are our initial thoughts. That's one of our second asks. We want to have a much more detailed discussion with the village board or a committee of the village board or others, committee of residents, as to what kind of incentives and what amount of incentives might be appropriate within the financial environment in which we live. So the fourth part of Choose Lake Bluff are for those individuals who want to live in Lake Bluff. They haven't found a home that they are comfortable with, and they're looking at something new. They're looking at total redevelopment or a new build. So in that particular situation, we feel it's appropriate to have guidelines that are specifically addressed to the demolition of structures within the village, whether historic or not historic. And if we are looking at redevelopment, then our focus, and that's the right of an individual property owner to buy. We understand that. There's some people who that's going to be the right decision for them. But our focus then, from a preservation perspective, shifts from preservation of an individual structure, if that structure is going to be torn down, to the context of the neighborhood. So how will the new structure blend in, not from an architectural perspective, but from a setback perspective, from the context of history within the village. There are certain things that we feel the village can do that can help influence the reconstruction. Much of that is zoning, but we think a focus on streetscape is also appropriate. So in a quick, maybe not so quick, 20 minutes, that's the strategic framework. And I'm going to pause for a minute before I get into the nitty-gritty of recommended changes. I'm going to pause for a minute to see if there are questions or comments on the entire Choose Lake Bluff strategy.
Anybody at this point? All right, Steve, let's on. We'll see where we can go with this.
Okay.
Thank you.
So let's go to page 13, whoever's driving the slides. So we've been working on this for a couple of years. It's important to recognize this is still in draft form. We have a lot of work yet to do, but you asked us to put a placeholder in place for consideration, and that's what we did. There's some components of this placeholder that, and I'll talk about which ones those are, that we know we have debate. We know we have community members that are not particularly pleased with certain components of our recommendations, and those all need to be discussed. But we can't discuss in a vacuum. So this is our attempt to put an initial stake in the ground for discussion purposes. But that's what this is. This isn't, we don't think this is final. We think that there's a lot of work in a lot of different parts still to come. So that's number one. Number two, this reflects community input. This reflects the 5, 6, or 7 opportunities the community has had. We had very good turnout on our Zoom calls, and this input is reflected. It's also important that we really have tried to balance historic preservation, tried to balance preserving of individual structures with the individual owner's property interests. We understand that's a creative tension. We understand that for many people, their home is their biggest asset that they need to maximize when they move on. They need to maximize the value. We're trying to find a creative balance because we think that historically preserving a structure can add as much value as building, candidly, a brand new structure within the village. So we're trying to find the right balance. I don't think we found it yet, but we're trying to find that right balance. We do recognize that there are multiple ways to view these particular issues. And again, I want to re-emphasize, because this somehow seems to get lost often, but the ultimate decision on use of a property remains with the property owner. That's hard and fast. We understand that. And ultimately, the property owner can decide what they wish to do. So let's move on. What did we discuss in the listening sessions? We started listening sessions with this, and I'm sorry for the text heavy, but since we're on Zoom, I thought it was okay. So this is what we discussed, and we began discussions by looking at these 5 points. So what are we trying to do? We're, as the strategy of Choose Lake Bluff suggests, we're encouraging through education. That's our primary objective. Encourage through education the preservation and rehabilitation of historic structures on Lake Bluff. The flip side of that is to discourage, but not prohibit, discourage demolition of those structures. So we're looking through education in preservation over demolition. That's number 1. Number 2, the tool to do that is landmarking. So landmarking, which we'll talk about in 2 slides, how we go about landmarking. Landmarking is a process to identify individual structures, which I've been calling anchors, those community assets, those assets and buildings and real estate that signify Lake Bluff, that we would hopefully not lose, that we'll be able to maintain, that we'll find buyers who will love them, and we'll restore them, and we'll keep them as beautiful as they are now. That's the second process, is going through landmarking. We heard from our feedback sessions that there was a very specific desire to take some of the ambiguity, will my house be landmarked or not? So you have seen, and you will see in a minute, that we have identified, we have put a process in place to identify structures that the HPC believes are potential landmarks in the village. And we have published that list. There's a broad list and a small list. We published that list at the request of the individuals who were part of our feedback sessions, so that there is some certainty in which structures we're going to begin having conversations with property owners. So the third focus area, and this really goes back to why is this ordinance in place in the first place? The ordinance is in place, in my view, to provide time for property owners to have input into significant modification or demolition of an anchor, of a historic structure within the village, so that the community, first of all, is aware that there's a significant change potentially proposed for a particular structure, and has an opportunity to give their input, and the village has an opportunity to investigate through incentives potential modifications to plans or potential changes to a particular demolition request. So that's what this ordinance has done, is provide delays in issuing demolition permits, which we're proposing continue. However, we also heard from our feedback sessions that the administration, the time component required for redevelopment, not specifically related to teardowns, but for significant modifications to structures that are subject to HPC review, which I'll get to in a minute. But we have proposed a process to streamline, to fast track alterations to structures in certain circumstances, so that this becomes a process that needs to happen, but a process that is not delaying the work of the property owner in redevelopment. And finally, and again, this is reflected in our proposal based on feedback, our original draft of this proposal recommended the creation of historic districts. The feedback from property owners was such that it was pretty clear that a historic district that was not recommended by property owners would be a tough sell in the village. So we've modified our proposal to keep districts in the proposal, but to allow districts only if property owners pre-approve, a proportion of property owners pre-approve the development of the district and that property owners vote on that district. So in effect, there would be no nomination of districts by the village, by the HPC. It would have to be done by residents within that proposed district. So those were the focus areas. Our next page is just a feedback to public comment. You have the detailed comment in your handouts. The comments came under 3 general headings. Financial, a concern that a delay in a sale, a delay in a potential delay in a sale because of historic preservation concerns was perceived to be onerous by some. There were some individuals who felt that resale values might be affected and there might be difficulty in selling a home if it was identified as historic. I think there's general consensus that incentives rather than restrictions are positive, and that's something we agree with and want to pursue in much more detail. And we did hear very clearly that some buyers are attracted to Lake Bluff. The perception is because of the lack of restrictions, because things can be done fast and things can be done at the more at the discretion of the property owner or the future buyer. So administrative, there was concern about unnecessary burdens, and that's the fast track process that we'll talk about in a minute. There was discussion that current regulations are working now. Much of the context, we're not proposing a change in the structure of historic preservation. We're tweaking it more than modifying it. So there was some suggestion that things are working fine now. Why do we need to change? There is a threshold for review of structures. Any structure that is 50 years old or older is subject to HPC review of demolition or significant changes. That's not a change that's in the existing ordinance. We'll talk about how that works in a minute, but that is a concern by some that 50-year number is arbitrary. Talk about why that's in place. And then the concept of certainty, the concept of we needed to be non-ambiguous as to which structures, if this process proceeds, which structures that we will be talking with property owners around potential landmarking or around knowledge sharing about their particular structure. Okay, so let's go to the proposed changes. The proposed changes are in 4 parts. This is the first part, how do landmarks get designated? The second part is what landmarking means. What are the implications of landmarking? The third is what happens to changes or demolition of non-landmark structures. And then the fourth is what we're proposing on historic districts. So first, designating a landmark. And this is, we spent a lot of time at each of our feedback sessions. We went through these slides with our feedback participants. So how does a property get landmarked? So we're suggesting that a landmark application can be made only by the property owner, which is by far the preferred way that we would love to see landmarks happen, or by the Historic Preservation Commission or by the village board. The History Museum was able to nominate, it currently is able to nominate, and the History Museum would like to be removed as a nominator at its own request. It's important to note that the Historic Preservation Commission studies and makes recommendations to the village board, but the village actually is the body that is responsible for actually designating landmarks. So let me be very clear here. Under the current ordinance and under our recommendation, landmarking can occur without the property owner's consent. We're not happy with that. We don't want to do that. We talked a lot about it. It is not preferred. It's something we need to continue discussing. But as again, the stake in the ground, this is the place that we have come down, that at this point, we are recommending that the village board essentially could landmark a property without the owner's consent. Now, there's some caveat to that, which I'll get to in a minute. So that's A. Under B, it again is critical to recognize that landmarking affects only designated portions of the exterior of an individual property. We're not talking about interiors at all. Property owners can do what they wish with the interior of their property. We're really thinking about, in a landmark, we're really thinking about preserving the streetscape of that property so that the visual impact of that particular property is maintained for future generations. So additions to the rear are fine, generally. Additions to the sides are fine, generally. But we're not only interested in the exterior, the preservation of certain exterior features of a property. Item C is directly from the feedback sessions. So in order to have some certainty over which structures the HPC will discuss landmarking in an attempt to have the property owner voluntarily consider landmarking their property. Not to force them, not to cajole them, but hopefully to provide whatever education we can to enhance that property owner's understanding of the historical context of their structure within the history of the village. So based on this, we need some certainty over this. There is now a published list of significant properties that we would like to have conversations with property owners about potential landmarking. Now, there's been some discussion as to where this list came from. So let me give you 2 minutes on that. Over the last 7 years, the village has retained a consulting firm, Benjamin Historic Consultants, to survey from a historic perspective every structure within the village. There are 4 separate surveys. The last one was finished at the end of 2019, delivered in 2020. So every structure within the village has been reviewed, and based on criteria that are contained in the regulations governing National Register status, National Register of Historic Places status, the consultants assigned a significance category to every structure. They determined whether each structure in the village was significant, contributing, or non-contributing. So one of the things that would be in the online Lake Bluff database is that significance rated, significant, contributing, or non-contributing. So that's where the significant list came from. We used the significant rated structures as the beginning point to create a shorter list that is in the memo attached to the recommended ordinance changes. We have said one other thing in item C, and that's, let me put it in vernacular, give us 3 years and we will have made recommendations around every structure in the village that the HPC considers, should consider for landmarking. So this is not going to go on forever. Give us 3 years. This should have been done a long time ago, but for a variety of reasons hasn't. Within 3 years, we will have gone through the process of understanding, working with property owners, hopefully having voluntary landmarks. But at the end of 3 years, we're not going to go through this process again. So give the village a short period of time to understand each individual property and the property owners in respect to landmarking. The 4th item here is that we have a number of properties that are either individually listed on the National Register or the Downtown Commercial District, which is a national district. There is a presumption in the ordinance that they qualify for landmark status within the village. There was also a process that is allowed in the current ordinance that would allow for involuntary landmarking of a property after a demolition request had been received by the village. So it became a gotcha kind of a situation. The village has done that a number of times. Individual bought a property, requested a demolition permit, and then the HPC and the village landmarked that property and delayed that demolition going forward. None of us liked that. So we're suggesting here, again, give us this 3-year time period and that process would end. So if we get 3 years to do our work, we won't be involuntarily landmarking even in the face of a demolition request. The item F, landmark status is maintained if property ownership changes. So this is not just one property owner wanting a landmark. It goes to succeeding owners. That's not a change that currently is in place. And then just to be clear, that landmark status ends if the property is demolished or is significantly altered. So that's how a landmark becomes designated. What does it mean to be a landmark? By the way, there are 23, I think, existing structures within the village that are landmarks. There's another 5 or 6 that were landmarked but have been demolished. So there's not a lot. So what are the implications of landmarking? To go to the next slide, please. So remember, this page applies only to landmarks. It applies only to those 23 structures now in place and to any future landmarks that might be put in place in the 3 years to come. So what happens to a landmark? So if there is a request for a demolition by a property owner or a significant alteration, and we'll define what that means in a minute. So if a property owner wants to demolish or significantly alter a landmark, there is an advisory review built into the current historic preservation ordinance and recommended to continue. So how long, and this is really the meat of the ordinance. So remember, property owners they control what happens ultimately to their property. So the teeth of the historic preservation ordinance is really in this delay in the issuance of a building permit. So how long are we suggesting that we delay, potentially maximum, the alteration or demolition request? So for alterations to a landmark, we are recommending that there be up to a 95-day delay, 35 days by the Historic Preservation Commission, and an additional 60 if the village board approves. We're suggesting an additional 30 days. That's primarily procedural and process. And again, just to give HPC and the village board an opportunity to talk with the property owner about potential alterations. Demolition, so this is a total demolition of a landmark. And remember, these are just landmarks. So we are recommending a 365-day potential maximum delay. So 120 days that the Historic Preservation Commission reviews the situation, and potentially an additional 245 by the village board. So why are we doing this? This is very specific. There are two reasons. One is so that neighbors, adjoining property owners, and the rest of the village is given advance notice that there is a significant change or demolition to a particular anchor structure within the village. And then critically, to provide a lengthy period of time to have conversations with the property owner around potential alternatives to full demolition, around incentives that might be available, both financial and zoning relief. So we are suggesting that what is now a 150-day delay, 120 by the Historic Preservation Commission and 30 more by the board, be increased at the board level so that there's a maximum of 365 days to have these conversations. And these do work. We have had a number of very good conversations with potential property owners that have resulted in non-demolitions, alterations to building plans, incorporation of the components of a historic structure into a new design. And that takes time. That takes time to happen. The third component here is that we're recommending that the property owner needs to participate in all of these, property owner or a designee acting as with power of attorney. Property owner must participate. So that's the implication for a landmark. And items B and C are if you would, the plus sides of landmark status. So currently, there are potential incentives for preservation and rehabilitation rather than demolition in terms of state property tax deferrals and other incentives. And the Village of Lake Bluff has either reductions or waivers of building fees, connection fees, and other permit related fees. We are recommending that these financial incentives become much more robust so that a property owner has alternatives to demolition, that potentially looking at property tax freezes, potentially looking at perhaps grant structures, either from the village or from nonprofit organizations that will help an individual rehabilitate, pay for rehabilitation. We're looking especially on our smaller lots in the village for zoning flexibility, working with the PCZBA and the village board to permit realistic rehabilitation of historic properties by looking at setbacks and other provisions of the zoning code. And that's where we actually get a lot of interest from developers. And then other financial incentives as appropriate. The other side of this is if we're looking at demolition of a landmark, we think there should be strict application of existing building and zoning regulations so that we're not looking at an individual who wants to tear down a landmark and then is looking for variances to what is legally permissible on that particular property. So that's the implication of a landmark. Now let's go to non-landmarks. So non-landmarks, these are right now everything in the village except for the 23 structures that are considered landmarks within the village. So this is the vast majority of structures in the village. So there is a trigger point that currently exists within the existing ordinance. What do we look at? What triggers the HPC review of a change to a structure within the village? And using standards that have been developed nationally by the National Register folks, there is a 50-year threshold. So structures that are 50 years old or older are subject to a review if a demolition permit or a significant demolition building permit have been requested. So a significant demolition throughout this ordinance is one that involves more than 50% of the exterior walls of a structure. There's a technical change to make this easier to apply and easier to understand within the process. So there has been feedback on the 50-year threshold. Is that too short? Is that too long? We are suggesting that it stay at the 50-year threshold since that is a recognized national preservation standard. So for a non-landmark that is 50 years old, that has a demolition or significant alteration request. So by the way, any structure within the village that is not a landmark, that is not being demolished, and where the alteration is less than 50% of the exterior wall doesn't go before HPC at all. So this is only for the very significant demolition requests or alteration requests. But for the ones that need to come before the HPC, again, there is the process step here is that there's a potential delay in the issuance of the permit. We are recommending 180 days, 120 by the HPC and 60 by the village board. That is up from 120 that is currently in place. And again, more time for discussion of alternatives we think is a good thing. And that's why we suggested an additional 60 days. We have also in item C put an expedited review in place. The vast majority of significant modifications that come before us are modifications to smaller ranch homes in the village that are almost always approved in one meeting with encouragement from the Historic Preservation Commission. It's a fast process because the alteration is being done to a structure that is not significant in the historic context, and it is being done in the context of its streetscape, of its location. But we are suggesting an expedited process. There are many ways to do this. The expedited process that we've identified is for the, before this would go to the full, so in the absence of the expedited process, there would be a request for significant alteration. The property owner would have to appear at the next regularly scheduled HPC meeting, make a presentation. The HPC would deliver and make a recommendation. What the expedited process recommends is that the HPC chair can make a determination that the alteration is not contradictory to the objectives of the Historic Preservation Ordinance. And if the chair so determines, then the historic preservation process ends. So in effect, it's a, let's say, a 7 to 10 day process rather than a 40 to 60 day process for the vast majority of potential alterations within the village. As I said, there are lots of ways this could be done. Again, putting a stake in the ground, we're suggesting this expedited process. And last is the proposal for historic districts. As I said before, in our original recommendation, we had contemplated a more traditional historic district that would be nominated either by property owners within the district or by the HPC or by the village board. Based on feedback from our listening sessions, we have revised our proposal, and we still think districts are a good idea, but the process for completing an application can only, in this recommendation, be done by one or more property owners within the proposed district, and that application needs to include written support of the lesser of, because districts are different sizes, the lesser of 10 property owners or 50% of the owners within the proposed district. So we're viewing this as a owner-nominated district, and property owners and neighbors need to agree. So we're thinking of this as a group of neighbors, like-minded neighbors, who wish to preserve the streetscape of their neighborhood and wish to voluntarily band together to provide a higher degree of protection against alterations to structures within that district. There's a voting process. We have suggested 50% of the property owners need to vote, and the majority of those voting need to affirm. That 50% is subject to discussion. The voting process is subject to discussion. But the implications of a historic district, remember, these are property owners that are nominating the district and identifying either contributing or non-contributing structures within that district. So if a demolition or alteration request is made after a district is created, the effect, the delay, if you would, is based on whether it's a contributing or a non-contributing structure using the rules that apply to a landmark or a non-landmark. Happy to go into more detail with that, but that's a significant change from what we had done in the past. So as we get into discussion, I'm thinking of 3 next steps. I've talked about all 3 of them. The first is we would like feedback on the strategic framework. We would like peer authorization to work on the educational materials, to populate the Lake Bluff Online database, to do, if you would, the first 2 components, education and knowledge, of the Choose Lake Bluff strategy. We think that's a good first step. It's something that we think will enhance the appeal of the village to potential buyers. So we'd like your feedback on that. We would definitely like to work with the village board or other bodies on incentives for rehabilitation. We think that's an exciting new proposal that should enhance what we're trying to do with historic preservation. So we ask for your guidance there and your active participation. And then finally, the ordinance revisions itself. We would like to have conversations at some point around the specifics, each of the specific components of the revised ordinance. We think it's important when we have that conversation to look at it in the context of the strategic framework. What are we trying to do with demolition delay? What are we trying to do with potential involuntary landmarking? Or if we decide that property owners have to agree to have landmarks, what protection do we have for the village in the face of potential tear downs and redesign of structures within the village? So those are the three things: the strategic framework, the rehabilitation, and the ordinance provisions. And would love to get some feedback.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Does anyone else from your group want to talk right now, or do you want to hear from the board side?
If anyone from the group, I think our group has met about this and has listened to the same things and seen the same presentation quite a few times.
Right. What I'm going to ask right now, because there has been a tremendous amount, of interest, there's been a tremendous amount of input and work done by the HPC and contributed to by numerous community members also. I very much want to hear from our individual village board members exactly. I'm going to ask each of you exactly what you may like about this and then what you may have concerns about. Because I think that the HPC and the community needs to kind of hear where your thoughts are on this. So I'll open it up at the moment. Does anyone want to start from our board?
I'm happy to start.
Thank you.
Get us going.
Good, thanks.
The first thing I wanted to do was thank the HPC. This is a tremendous amount of work that you guys have done. And clearly you've had lots of meetings, you've talked to lots of residents, and you've put in a lot of time and energy for this. So thank you. I really appreciate that. I love the idea of the education piece. I think that is a great starting point for everything. And not just educating people that are currently in historic homes, but people coming into the community. So I love that idea, and I think that's a great starting point. I think that I've watched a lot of meetings, so I've heard a lot of public comment, and I understand there's some concerns in the real estate industry, our folks in the real estate industry with resale. I know there's some concerns over homeowners feeling like they want to have their own rights over their property. And so taking all of that into account, I think that we've come up with a fairly good plan that probably needs a little more tweaking. I had a couple of questions as Chair Kraus was going through talking. Such a thorough presentation, so thank you. I was originally under the impression that the landmarking would be done in the first 3 years by, you all would go to community members and ask them if they wanted to landmark, and that was up to them, and the village still had the ability to landmark, or the HPC had the ability to recommend landmarking. And then at year 4, that was going to kind of sunset out, and it would be the property owner's decision to landmark. So I may have gotten that wrong, or that may have changed over the last few meetings. But it sounds like now the HPC still can continue to request designation, even if the owner doesn't want it. Am I right in understanding that?
No, we haven't changed. So you were right, and I probably misspoke. So the ask from the HPC is if you give us a period of time, a 3-year period of time to do our work, to work with property owners to hopefully have voluntary landmarking. At the end of that 3-year period, the HPC, in consultation with the village board, would make a determination, are there any structures that should be considered for involuntary landmarking? If yes, then proceed. If no, then that process would end. And again, that's to have certainty for the property owner as to what's going to be landmarked or not. So you were right the first time.
Okay. So I really think in that instance, our and I'm sure for you all as well, the goal is to get homeowners on 3 years, because the last thing we want to do is to get to the end of the 3 years and have a lot of inventory sitting there that now we're forced to make a decision if we want to landmark against homeowners' wishes, right? That's not where we want to go. I'm always impressed by the residents of Lake Bluff, and I feel like they do try to do what's in the best interest of their home and their neighbors and also the village. So I usually I have a tendency to put a little more faith in the homeowners and let them kind of drive those decisions, but I also understand the need for the landmarking. I really like the idea of the incentives and the idea of zoning and using those tools as a way to incentivize people to continue to understand historic preservation and why it's important. So I would love to continue to go down that road and explore those options. I think those sort of incentives really help when we're trying to do this kind of landmarking and preservation. And I did have one last question. I think it was maybe the last slide there. Sorry, my son was sort of coming in asking me a question, which happens when we're on Zoom sometimes. But we were talking about the review process and 50 years or older, subject to review. I think it was part C there that was talking about homes that weren't in the 50-year, or homes that were in the 50-year criteria but were not considered significant, and this was a new thing now. They were also going to have to go in front of the HPC, and I guess I was just wondering, I know you explained it, but to me that feels a little heavy-handed. If it's not a historically significant home, and now we're asking people to come in front of the HPC. Yeah, it was part C there. Thank you.
So we're actually trying to make this easier rather than less easy. So let me use the conversation, the examples that were used in the feedback session. So the discussion was around the terraces. Okay. So most of the homes in the terraces in the next, if they aren't already, in the next 10 years will hit the 50-year threshold. So under the basic guidelines in the Historic Preservation Ordinance, 50-year threshold, which we suggest be continued. The number of homes that would reach that 50-year threshold and therefore be subject to potential HPC review is likely to increase as our housing stock ages. Okay. So recognizing that there is a different level of review for certain structures than there are for others, even though they're all 50 years old, we have installed Part C, which is the expedited review process. Okay. So that would allow a process to be done within 10 days, 15 days, 7 days, so that individuals who are altering a structure that happens to meet the 50-year threshold but are not identified as significant wouldn't even need to come before the board. It would be done administratively. Okay. Through a process. So it would be streamlined and much faster, but it would still have the 50-year threshold there as a potential, review, as an important potential review stopping point. Okay.
I feel like it's just a home in the terraces that you guys looked at on West Washington, the Grums, and that went through, it seemed like a very short process. So was that an example of what we would see in Part C, or how would that be different?
That's exactly an example. That's the perfect example. That's one that wouldn't even have gone before the HPC. That would have been done administratively, and the property owner wouldn't have had to have the angst about appearing before a commission. Okay. That would have been done without a formal review.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you. That's about what I have so far. I feel like So much work has been put into this. Oh, I did want to add, I'm not a fan of the historic districts. And I'll tell you, the reason I'm not so much a fan of them is I feel like by placing all of that on the residents, potentially we could be pitting neighbors against neighbors. And I'm not a fan. I guess generally speaking, I'm just not a fan of the historic districts. I feel like if you want to landmark your own home, that's great. You can go ahead and do that. And potentially if you had 3 or 4 people together that had decided on their own to landmark, maybe they want to come together and create a small historic district. But I feel like it puts a lot of pressure on a specific neighborhood. If you need 50% to landmark, if you've got people in that group that are dissenting and not happy with it, now you've got a potential situation where you've got neighbors unhappy with other neighbors, and that's just not something I like to see in Lake Bluff. So that's just my own personal opinion on that. Everything else, I felt like the structure of it was moving in the right direction. I'm just not particularly a fan of the historic districts.
Thanks. And just a quick comment. I absolutely agree with you that the way this is structured, if there are any districts, it would be a small group of contiguous property owners who would all agree. That would be the most logical and the easiest way to have a district. We think it's important is too strong, nice is not strong enough. It would be an asset to the village if those like-minded property owners would have a vehicle to add a degree of protection. Obviously, if they could voluntarily landmark their own structure, but this would be another tool. So okay. I hear you. We understand. Lots more work to do on districts.
Thank you. I mean, you guys have done a tremendous amount of work, so thank you. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Joy, for that good feedback. Who would like to go next?
I'll take a swing at it, Kathy.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mark.
To the HPC, once again, as Joy pointed out, as they say, this easily falls into yeoman's work. Y'all have put together 5 or 6 years of perpetual, I'm sure it seems, effort toward trying to find a way to satisfy a preservation goal while seeking a way that is somehow equitable to community members. Steve, you asked about the Choose Lake Bluff, and I certainly think that is a positive program. It does help to advance the notion of creating a community that's sensitive to its history and its context, and I think that's that only is positive for us. There really isn't any negative to that. I've made some notes and kind of reordered and recrunched things a bit during the course of your presentation, trying to figure out what my own personal lens is on this. And number one is the number one thing for me is preservation and finding a way to preserve the historic context of our village. We've heard from a number of residents on this. The outcry is clear about property rights and so forth. At the same time, when the tough part, I think, for all of us is when we have a very sensitive project or demolition or something like that come up. We have a huge upswing of concern at the same time from folks. How can you tear this house down on fill in the blank street? You know, it's important to the historic context to the village, and it's important to the streetscape and so forth and so forth. So I think we have to be, we need to be sensitive to the concerns of the community. Secondly, a couple of these things I pirated from you, Steve. Property owner in control, encourage rather than enforce. And the last word that I caught that I wanted, that resonated with me is balance. And so at that point in time, it really becomes a question of what are the mechanics for all of this, and trying to find some middle ground. And, you know, it's always easy to come in at the 11th hour and make good use of all the effort that another group has spent. But some things that I thought about, first of all, consider landmarking as purely a voluntary process. And in a way that might avoid a de facto routing of everything, something that would avoid putting the HPC or the village in a position of identifying for homeowners that their home is a landmark. If we already have something on the books that uses the 50-year as a placeholder, as a guideline, consider continuing to use that, and continuing to use the HPC using the tools that it does. I like a number of the components here that are up on the screen right now for non-landmark. We're in a home that's going to be, well, it already is, I guess, here in the terrace is well over 50 years. So we would be subject to that. If I needed to do something, I'd certainly appreciate some sort of an expedited review on that too. But basically you try to utilize and leverage what's in place there. And if at the same time, make available, I would be in favor of making available the extended review periods for demolition or significant changes to a property, to allow the board to set an extended period of time. I think we've had, as you mentioned, we've had some positive experiences where we've been able to work with homeowners to find a way to be able to maintain the historic context of their homes in a way that satisfies them and their practical needs, while at the same time preserving the streetscape, preserving the historic context in the village. So I think that's my take on it. Joy brought up a really good point about the historic districts. I'm somewhat concerned about a couple of things. She points out pitting neighbor against neighbor. I would say by and large that to me that a 50% threshold is probably low. If I was to include and I'm not, I'll be a private citizen here. But if I was looking at this, I would probably look at something with a somewhat higher threshold. The other possibility, quite frankly, is, you know, if you had this, I would say that you have 3 or 4 neighbors who are together on a particular street, let's say, or around a particular corner, and they're sitting around having coffee or an adult beverage and thinking about this and saying, well, this would really be interesting if we did this, which is exactly how the conversation I would expect would start to set up a historic district. And if they're that interested, then go in together and voluntarily landmark their 3 or 4 homes along whatever street or avenue in Lake Bluff that they might choose to do. The beginning, the outset, the initiation is likely to be the same. It's certainly the motivation would be the same as well. So again, I can't thank the HPC enough for their extensive work on this. And there's some tremendous amount of time and effort brought forward here. And thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for your thoughtful comments. Who'd like to go next?
Madam President, I'll go next.
Thank
If you'd
you,
like.
Please.
Well, first, appreciate the hard work, very much appreciate the hard work and dedication of both Chairperson Kraus and all of the members of the HPC on this important issue. I think it's an issue of great moment and consequence to the citizens of Lake Bluff. And on a personal level, I like almost all of what I've heard tonight and commend the very, very thoughtful work. I do share the concern of HPC member Minor over the ability of the village to landmark without the owner consent. And I think we've heard that concern at least voiced throughout the discussion tonight. So I think I'd respectfully recommend that as things go forward, really to remove that ability to designate a landmark status on anybody's private home in Lake Bluff without the owner consent. I'm just concerned, among other things, the obvious infringement on property rights for what is probably not a sufficiently compelling reason in Lake Bluff. We'd also face potentially, in some instances, I think, the prospects of litigation. I think we've had enough of that in Lake Bluff concerning developments, issues, and so on. So I'd really like to avoid that. That'd be my respectful recommendation. The district's really raised the same issue. So I think with a tweak of that, that would be helpful. That's at least my thought process. Very much appreciate the de facto carve out of the terraces. You know, it sounds like procedurally there'll be tools available, and that's a very good thing. So really all in all, and of course all the hard work that you guys have done on the branding and so on, all of that is to be greatly commended. I do have one question, and Steve Kraus, Chair Kraus, perhaps you can address this. Help me understand that in the instances of where we are giving property tax relief, I assume we have power only to affect the village of Lake Bluff share, about 9% of the property tax. Correct, Chair Kraus?
That's correct.
Yeah, I suppose one consideration I'd have, and maybe this is, or one suggestion, and maybe this is either naive or unreasonable or unrealistic, but maybe I'd ask anyway, is whether there might be a consideration of the ability to spread out that burden. But, you know, really it's a benefit that if we achieve many of these positives that you've talked about, Chair Kraus, in this process, why not have perhaps at least some consideration of spreading that revenue burden out to some of the other taxing bodies? I mean, I think it should be a pretty obvious proposition that, you know, the Park District, for example, is another taxing body that contributes to the property tax bill. Do all of the laudable things that we'd like to achieve for Lake Bluff and so on. But maybe you could, I don't know. I guess I would suggest that maybe that effort be made, because with all the good things that you've presented, all the positive sides of this, it certainly would benefit all of those taxing bodies as well, as they're all important parts of our community. So again, with that, those are my suggestions. I am concerned about the involuntary aspect of it. And Chair Kraus and all the members of the HPC, thank you for all of your hard work.
Thank you, Bill, for your comments also. Next?
I speak next.
Okay.
I'll echo a thank you to the HPC and all of the current and past members who have significantly contributed all this work. I'll try to restrict my comments to things that I think are a little bit different. But one of the terms that was used in the presentation that I'm a little bit concerned about, which is talking about these homes that may be significant as community assets, because they are individual homes, and I prefer the term visual anchors, because everyone's allowed to share in visually what's there, but to call it a community asset, you know, makes it appear to be something that other people own, and I don't think that that is
is helpful. I think it adds to a little bit of the argument that people who don't own your home have more of a right than actually do to tell you what you can do or not do with your home. So I guess I much prefer visual anchors to the term community assets, because I think it is much more descriptive of what is actually true. The other thing I wanted to say was that I know it's kind of a mystifying aspect to say, well, who are these homes or homeowners, and who might be considered a community asset or a visual anchor. And you've put together a list of potential properties, and I thank you for that. I know that was a challenge to put out there, and then once it was out there, there was some pushback by homeowners. I guess my suggestion would be for those homeowners who had strong objection or issue with their home being on there, I would hope that the HPC would have ears to hear those concerns. And if it really is something that a homeowner objects to, I don't know how long that process goes on. It seems like there's been real strong objections, and I'd hope that if the property owner does not wish to be pursued any further, that the HPC would respect that. It goes a long way toward promoting what we all want Bluff to be. We talk about our character, and we talk about how we are good neighbors and all of these things. And I think that would foster that sense of community, caring for each other and respecting each other, to do that. I also don't agree with the nomination process being by someone other than the property owner. I think it needs to be the property owner. Education is a great tool to share information, and we're using that information to hopefully have a homeowner make a different decision, more in favor of preservation, which is great. But I almost feel like the way the information is being presented, it's that when you say choose Lake Bluff, it's almost like, and this is just my opinion, that we're trying to choose who the homeowners are. And to a large degree, it's the market that determines who the homeowners are. The property is valued at what the market will bear, and people decide they're either going to buy a house or not going to buy a house at whatever particular point in time. We do want people to choose Lake Bluff for what we are, but we're not, we aren't choosing who the homeowners are. And I just want to be sure that the education process, it's a process that it's information that can be presented. It's not like a class that homeowners have to take and pass, like your government class, or you don't graduate high school. It needs to be an optional educational. It's there, people can use it. Some people will appreciate it. Some people won't read it or appreciate it. Again, I feel like we need to emphasize that education is great, but at the end of the day, the homeowner does choose Lake Bluff. We don't choose who the homeowners are. I'm very excited about incentives being the biggest tool that we have. I think that's a positive way to influence behavior. And I think that's it as far as things that I think are maybe haven't been said yet. Again, thank you for all your work.
Thanks, Barbara, for your thoughts. Aaron, I think you're left.
Yeah, so I guess I'm the last trustee who's currently present to chime in. So
Thank you.
I have the benefit of reiterating a lot and hopefully chiming in on one new point. I'll start with the historic district. I think the ability of a neighbor to decide the fate of another neighbor's home is totally inappropriate. I think historic districts are perfectly fine, but I think it needs to be much more than 50% to vote, and then a majority of that 50% to determine what gets nominated as a historic district. I understand that that it's ultimately the village board who decides, but I think that a much larger percentage, and perhaps 100% of homeowners should have should be able to approve a historic district. With that said, I think it's a great idea. I think it's a great tool. If there's a group of homeowners who are who want to make their block or their corner or whatever you decide to make it a historic district, as long as it's 100% voluntary, I think it's a great tool. But it needs to be, for a district to happen, I think it has to be 100% voluntary. As far as involuntary landmarking, I'm kind of in the same position as the other trustees. I think that it should be up to the homeowner. I think nomination can be done by the HBC or the village board. I don't see the village board really doing that, so it would likely be the HBC. So I think that can happen, but I think in order to landmark a property, it has to be voluntary by the homeowner. I don't think we should be able as a government body to put those restrictions in place. And if it was, because what's being proposed is not only an involuntary landmarking status, but also additional restrictions put in place. I think if it was one or the other, then I have a little bit more stomach for it. But because it's both a involuntary landmarking and additional restrictions placed on those landmarks, that gets me a little bit uncomfortable. All that being said, I'm in favor of preservation. I think we have some amazing homes in Lake Bluff. And so the education piece, the incentive piece, we absolutely need to do those things, because it is certainly the streetscape, certainly those old homes that really bring a lot of character to our village. So it's a balance, and it's a hard balance. We want to protect homeowners' rights. We want to protect the neighborhoods. And so finding that balance, which I know you've been working on. I mean, you've been working on it for years. I just have a really hard time allowing involuntary landmarking and more restrictions at the same time. Granted, I'll be a private citizen in just about a month, so that's the comments of a private citizen like Mark. But I think we've heard a lot of comment from other private citizens, private village residents, who have similar opinions. So I think this is a good start. I think this conversation has been constructive. I think we've gained some ground, and I think we have some direction for the HPC to go forward. But we're certainly not at a final product.
Thanks, Aaron, very much. Okay, I'll put my 2 cents in, as I'm soon to be a private citizen also. But I'll start back a little bit thinking. Over 30 years ago, Janet Nelson and I went to the then village board and suggested that they might want to consider having some type of historic preservation commission. And it took us about 10 years of cajoling, nagging, and suggesting that occur. I don't think the idea is never to be individual property rights versus preservation. I agree it's a balance. It has to be, because they can coexist and they should coexist. I think the HPC has worked very hard to try to craft things and recraft things and talk to people to try to work some things out that will be to the benefit of our village. It is charming. It has unique. I talked to someone on Saturday who just moved to town who said, I love all the different streetscapes and I love the variety of homes and how they're preserved and how that. So those things are very important, but so is individual property rights. Very important. I believe in the carrot instead of the punitive. I really, truly think, seriously look at incentives and a variety of incentives and enticements to get people interested, you know, in maybe doing this, into thinking, well, how I might be able to do this and have some incentive and encouragement to do so. So I'm very much in favor of that. Education to me, obviously, is a huge piece. I think we haven't even scratched the surface of educating community and new people and talking about this and having dialogues with this and doing things to enhance the architecture and historic value of our homes. And I think we can do a lot more. And that to me is a big piece. And that's a positive piece. And that's not a punitive piece in order to do that. I also agree with pretty much the other trustees. I am very uncomfortable with non-volunteer designations. I do believe it should be the property owners have to make that decision. And I think education, incentives maybe can help them to do this, but I think it has to be homeowners must make this important decision. I don't think it can be dictated. And I think that in the long run will hurt us all to do that. So as we move ahead here, and I think the dialogue has been really constructive, and I actually thank you very much to our trustees for being very honest and forthright with what they said. This was a good discussion. I have to chime in, and the HPC has been wonderful in really trying to solicit people's opinions in the community, and will continue to do so. And eventually, you know, it will come up, you know, within the next few months to a new village board. And then that process will continue, and hopefully we will come up with something that is compatible and is workable within our community. Steve, do you have anything else that you would like to say or your group would like to say?
Just thank you to the trustees for all of your feedback and comments. As not surprising to all of you, we've debated this for so long, but we've talked about all of these issues, but getting your direct feedback is very helpful. And when we meet next month, we will review, I've been taking notes, review each of your comments. There's some themes I see already running through. There's some inherent contradictions in what we're trying to do, and we'll sort through this so that when the time is appropriate with the new board, we will be able to have another discussion with some revisions based on community feedback, your feedback, and what we come up with over the next month or two. So thank you.
Okay, I understand that we have some community members, what do you call it, in the chat room already would like to speak. Is that right, Drew?
There are several members, attendees.
Hello?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Kathy?
Drew, are you there?
I am here.
He's muted.
Hold on.
That might be good. All right.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we can hear you. I understand
Okay.
there's some folks that would like to speak.
Well, you have several attendees. If they would like to speak, they should raise their hand.
Okay.
And then you can, if they don't wish to speak, then obviously
They don't wish to speak.
Then there's no public comment. Oh, there's one.
Right.
The first one. Yep.
All right.
Mr. Weber, if you unmute yourself, you may offer comments.
Great. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Well, first off, thank you for hosting this. It's great to have community involvement. So I do want to thank the committee on this behalf. couple of things here that I've got a couple comments. I also wanted to share a couple concerns and have a couple questions. So my name is Rich Weber at 420 Sunrise Avenue. So that's the 420 Sunrise Avenue. 404, excuse me. 404 Sunrise Avenue. A little bit nervous. So sorry about that. So I was attentively looking at Mr. Krause's goals at historic preservation. When I look at this, and it's certainly my opinion, and I welcome other opinions, is the preserve historical resources and character. From what I tell is the study was done by Benjamin. But if I can use my house as an example, right? I renovated my house 10 years ago. Completely, I would say, probably 90%, I had renovated the house. So I'm not quite sure how that would qualify, right, for it being historically significant. Number one. When I look at number three, which is, I look at the words enhance and attractiveness. To me, those are subjective words. I also look at number 5, which is protect the aesthetics. Once again, I would also say those are subjective words. As it relates to number 4, improving property values, I would offer up a different opinion, and I'll get to that with regard to the concerns. With regards to the concerns that I got, there's 4 items I'd like to put on the table for the trustees and HPC to consider. Number 1, this creates unnecessary economic burdens and delays for homeowners needing to repair, modify, or sell their homes. Number 2, it decreases property values by encumbering properties and binding future owners to additional building restrictions and associated delays and financial burdens. Number 3, empowers the small faction to force designation of historic districts without the support of the majority of the affected homeowners. As I was listening to discussion today, the way it was presented, I would just like to make sure I understand the facts correctly as it relates to the mechanics for how this would work. My understanding is that the districts can be imposed even if the majority of the affected homeowners do not support the proposal. To defeat this proposal, more than 50% of all the affected homeowners must actively vote against it. Owners that do not vote are effectively counted as if they voted in favor of the district, even if they don't support it. That to me is not the same as obtaining consent of 50% or more. So I really appreciate the trustees' comments today with regards to historical districts and really empowering, right, the residents to have control of their property. So thank you. The last concern is this is an unwarranted effort, and it's certainly my opinion, to extend control over individual property owners. So I go back, when I highlight these particular concerns, I go back to, and I trustee DeWard mentioned this, right? Not force, but encourage. These concerns don't correlate to encouragement, but more so, penalty. So those are the concerns I'd like to put on the table. So thanks for listening to them. I do have 2 open questions. Number 1, if this were to proceed, would there be deed restrictions put in place? Question mark. Number 2, I was unfortunately unable to attend a number of the working sessions. So first off, thank you for hosting them. But was there communication sent out to the 45 designated homeowners who are under evaluation as being historically significant? I know, unfortunately, I was notified. I'll tell you, I was incredibly appreciative. Somebody left a flyer in front of doorstep the other day and said, "Hey, are you aware that this is going on?" So I guess I would just, for future consideration, ask for some proactive communication as it relates to potentially impacted homeowners. So those are my comments. Thank you for giving me the time tonight. Apologize a little bit for my nervousness. Thanks again. Problem.
Thank you very much. Drew, is there anyone else that would like to speak?
Yes, Mr. Sacknoff.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Lee, we sure can.
Good. Well, thank you very much for all the hard work here. I really do want to first thank Steve and the HPC. A lot of hard work. I agree with you all. I applaud all the effort. I can see that this has been a yeoman's job getting this together. I also want to acknowledge Steve for acknowledging that this is a balance that has not been reached yet. And also the other trustees who've said, Mark, I know you mentioned that you talked about finding a balance. I'm a little confused by Steve's comment that he's unhappy with his decision to control some of the properties and override the wishes of some of the property owners. It's a bit conflicting, but I admit it's something we can deal with at another time. I want to thank the board members, the majority of board members who support a voluntary approach to landmarking and the importance of property rights. Pretty important. A couple of weeks ago, at least at the last meeting, I spoke up. I addressed the committee and objected to the proposed ordinance as being unfair, that it's potentially confiscatory. At that time, I talked about sudden changes, and believe me, 2020, if there's never been an example of great sudden changes, that was the year. People were on the move, they were moving quickly, fast. I look at my house, and I'm one of the houses that is designated at 629 Mountain Road as being somewhat of a storehouse of wealth. It's somewhat of a piggy bank. It's where some rainy day funds might be kept. It's completely paid for. If something were to happen to me, and I'm at the stage in life that something will and could, eventually will, I'm going to need to get some money out. I might have to go to a nursing home. I spoke about this at length at my last meeting, and I don't want to be in a position where I can't get that money out to do something like go into a nursing home, have special care, maybe have to move to a different climate, certainly not be in a 3-story house. I'd want to do that relatively quickly and not want to wait 365 days. I think there's a pretty good likelihood that my house would be a candidate for demolition for the new buyers. Well, I give this analogy because I gave it last time. If I were to go to the bank and I said, Mr. Lake Forest Trust or Northern, something's come up, I need to take my $1 million out of the savings account. And the bank says, you've been a wonderful customer, thanks very much. I want you to know that we'll cut that check. Please come back in 365 days and you'll have it. Oh, and Mr. Sacknoff, there's one other thing. We will not be able to pay you any more interest on the money, we hope. One other thing. Would you please check with us every month, maybe 30, 60 days, to see how we're doing? Now, this would be the time when some seniors, some people will be under distress. They may not be playing with a full deck of cards. They're going to have traumas perhaps in their lives. And in the meantime, we have to deal with not being able to cash in necessary chips. So, you know, this again, you could probably feel my blood boiling because I do believe that it's not very fair. But there are other things here that I want to discuss that are not showing sensitivity to the financial wherewithal of the people, the 25, 23 people who might be affected with landmark status. And that is, again, looking at 2020 as being a turning point, a quick turning point for a lot of people. People wanted out of Chicago, New York, San Francisco. The people were leaving for the hills, right? They would buy anything, sight unseen, multiple offers within hours of it. They wanted to be out of the city. They wanted to be in a safe and healthier environment. Now, if someone says, well, that's all well and good, but excuse me, you can't move here for at least a year if you plan to tear down, and the house may not be in appropriate shape the way you would want it, I don't think that's going to fly. They're going to go on to something else. And if they go on to something else, that leaves a much smaller universe, because this is not unique,
a much smaller universe of potential buyers. Well, the potential buyers, this is, Econ 101, fewer buyers, lower price. So already we've been put in a position where $1 million house, just hypothetically, $1 million house holding costs for a year is going to be 10%. That's $100,000. And excuse me, I know this may not seem like a lot to some people, but that's $300 a day. Frankly, I'm not in a position where I can just use it. If I'm holding, I can't move. The price that I'm going to get is going to be lower. Now, the other thing is that the person who might be in the position of saying, okay, I'll go through the motions, they're going to also discount the house because they know no different than radon or a floodplain. I'm not going to pay you full value. There's something wrong with this house. The thing that's wrong with this house, I won't be able to sell it. So this gets compounded throughout the process. I want to also explain, and I'm saying this because I think there's a lack of consideration to the financial consequences to these landowners, to the landmark homeowners. We talked about branding. Steve brought up branding, and I think that's a very good point. But the people who are branding Lake Bluff architecturally are the very people who have already paid heavy dues. We're the people who don't have great insulation. We're the people who don't have great electric. We're the ones who don't have all the outlets. We're the ones who have cave crickets. We're the ones with single pane glass. There's a reason they say they don't build them like they used to, because they weren't well made back then. The studs on my house are 2x4s. There's no insulation for them. Even if I were to put insulation into them, a standard construction house is 4x6. You'd have 50% more insulation. The house foundation that is the foundation for this very house is brick. It's a sieve. There's water in the basement. I have to deal with mold. I have to deal with the cave crickets. I have to deal with the smelly basement. Certainly not a concrete poured basement that's newer. So if you look at the statistics, as a house gets older, the maintenance cost goes up and up and up. And a typical 50-year-old house is 50% more expensive to heat. And I heat my house at 63 degrees in the wintertime. Anecdotally, I heat it at 60, and the comment bill says you should be paying a lot more. Well, that's based on more modern homes. I go to this to say that when we talk about branding, it's these older houses where people, out of the love of Lake Bluff and love of keeping the traditions alive, are digging into their own pockets. So to say that we are now going to be penalized, now that we have to move, maybe forcefully, very quickly have to move, but we're not going to get full value for it, is sort of an insult. So I'm going to just end this real quickly, and I do appreciate your consideration and listening to me. And again, much of what you people do is thankless, but you do a great job trying to improve this village, and I think it's a wonderful place. I couldn't think of a better place to live. And again, please, if you hear a little anger in my voice, I'm trying to get through. The question has come up several times in previous meetings with the Historic Preservation Committee as to how many people on the board, on this committee, are going to be affected with landmark status. The answer is none. So why has this question been asked? Well, the question has been asked in the traditional scheme of things is who's got skin in the game? The people who have skin in the game are the people who are already paying premium for the upkeep of their house. The ordinance does not affect the pocketbooks of the people that are making the decisions, who potentially are making the decisions. So I'm going to throw this out to you, just as a process, a thought process. In solidarity with those being affected by a 365-day moratorium on demolition, our committee members, that is the Historic Preservation Committee, or for that matter, the board members, are they willing to sign a pledge or an oath that would affect them in the same way? Whether serving now or after their terms end, would board members and HPC members pledge to prohibit occupancy of their properties for 365 days from the date of the closing of the sale of their property? I'm not asking for an answer, but I'd like you to reflect on that. But that's what's being asked of the 25 people who are a designated landmark. Again, I thank you. You guys do a wonderful job. It's a wonderful place, and it's because of volunteerism. And for that very reason, I would like the landmark designation to be a voluntary approach. Again, thank you for your time and your hard work.
Lee, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Anybody else, Drew?
Madam President, there was a question in the Q&A section that's been asked by Mr. Weber that was asking, he had commented about the question of the deed restrictions considered associated with historic preservation, and if any communications were sent to the 45 homeowners identified it as historic. And I just, if I may answer that real quickly, is that all right with you?
Absolutely.
So, Mr. Weber, so yes, when an ordinance is approved by the village board, landmarking a property, it is recorded against the property with the Lake County Recorder of Deeds. As far as any persons, homeowners on that list of properties, the answer is no, they were not notified specifically. I think, and Mr. Kraus can correct me if I'm wrong, but the HPC came up with that list at their last meeting, and there was a timing issue is one part of it, but the other part also is that the HPC had no specific intentions with that list or desired, I guess really no list, no direction of specificity with recommendations to the village board regarding that list, other than those are the properties that they've identified thus far to continue to study and would engage those property owners with the hopes and goals that they would pursue voluntary landmarking, not that they were going to seek involuntary landmarking. Am I wrong about that, Mr. Kraus?
No, you're correct. Excuse me. The intent certainly is to communicate and have discussions with all of the property owners of all significant structures. That's been something that we've been looking forward to doing for a long time. Because of timing and because of the uncertainty of this discussion and the ultimate resolution of the ordinance, it just didn't work out to have that communication in advance of this meeting. But certainly as we get additional direction from the village board, those discussions will be happening very, very quickly, very soon, and face to face if we can.
And Madam President, Deborah Fisher wishes to offer her comments.
Okay, Deb, it's all you.
Okay. I just wanted to point out, along with that same line of questioning, I guess, I did just kind of do a review of the 23 properties, and it looked like the owners of those 23 properties average about 13 plus years as owners. So, you know, there's certainly people that I would hope would be included, make sure they were included in the discussion, as opposed to not, because I think that we do, you know, as a village, as I think Mr. Sacknoff said, they have created part of this ambience and everything over those, decade plus years. So many of their 20 plus years. So it sounds like people are in the direction of going to voluntary, which I think would be wonderful. I also am one that feels that right now our timelines are not really broken. I'm not seeing indications that I just don't understand the adding on an additional doubling of time and how that really will add anything to the process. I think it stands the chance of demonizing neighbors more than doing something constructive. I think that 6 months is a long enough time, or 120 days in the case of a significant addition, et cetera. And I'm totally in favor of the incentivizing and the historical thing. I would love to see homes in the village, significant or not, have some additional either zoning or other kinds of incentives made available to them right beginning now. You know, I mean, start working on that process, I think, rather than waiting until they go under contract or that kind of thing, so that people are incentivized to consider additions and renovations and rehabs as opposed to new construction. The advantage is certainly clear that, hey, I can get a bigger house maybe, or I can go into the third story, or I can do something that adds to the significance and keeps the streetscape, which sounds like it is the major goal. I'd love to see that be a way to, a route to pursue, as opposed to being a more punitive kind of situation. So just my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you,
And
Deborah.
thank you for everything you do and for all the passion everybody shows on this.
Thank you. Drew, is there anyone else that would like to speak?
Not at the exact moment, but maybe you want to give them a moment and just.
Sure, no problem.
President O'Hara, may I make one more comment?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. I did have written down, and I think I just had so many things written down that I missed it. But one of the things that I did have written down was the time frame for the demolition, and I was just reminded of it by Deb Fisher. I'm wondering if maybe when we go back and look at that number, if we can compromise a little bit with that and maybe bring that number down a little bit. Rather than doing the full year, maybe we look at 9 months or, 270 days. Because, the last thing we really want to do is be punitive and to homeowners. And I think that it sounds like, from what we're hearing, the feedback that we're getting, that, a lot of these people that are currently in their homes and have been taking care of them for many years and put lots of money in them already, I don't think that they're the group of people that we want to be punitive towards. So I just to keep it top of mind, and I know you're already doing that, Chair Kraus. I know it's always top of mind, but just so that we keep that balance in mind. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else for the good of the order today on this? Again, I'm sorry.
I move we adjourn.
Okay. I just would like again to thank everybody, the HPC, the village board, everyone who participated tonight, all those people who have put their comments and sent them to us, everybody else. Thank you all very much. And I will need a motion to adjourn.
You have a first.
I have a first. And do I have a second?
Second.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Everyone have a good and safe rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you very much.